For those of you who are now joining us, we're with Juanita Salisbury. She's a landscape architect who is going to speak with us tonight about rain gardens. And as you just heard, if you happen to notice, she's been doing this for quite some time, a couple decades under her belt. Let me go ahead and so as we go through the program tonight, if you do have questions, please raise your hand. We will do Q&A through the Q&A bar. And Juanita, would you prefer people to hold their questions until the end, or would you like to take questions throughout?
Let's wait until the end. I think
Okay.
put their questions into the chat. That way they can write them down if they don't have to remember them for the whole length of the presentation.
Okay, so we'll do that. Questions will go in the chat then. Thank you. If you do, well, I guess we're not doing raise hands, so. So the chat here is where we'll be putting questions in, and I can make a little running log if there are things that we want to cover at the end of the presentation. Bosco does represent a number of agencies in our local area, from San Francisco down to the South Bay, 26 agencies in total, providing 1.8 million people and 40,000 businesses and community organizations with water in our area. So part of the program objective as far as this class series goes is to familiarize people with ways that they can conserve water outdoors. We've found that regionally, outdoor residential water use is one of the highest consumers of our local potable water supplies. So we're really working with local agencies and municipalities to educate the public and educate ourselves as to what we can do to get those numbers down and conserve our water resources. Those of you who are local know, obviously, we are really focusing on native and drought tolerant plants as part of landscape water conservation. So we'll be talking about that tonight. Bosca has a number of programs and rebates available to people in their service area. Lawn Be Gone is a lawn conversion program where you can remove your turf and get reimbursed based on the square footage of the turf that you're converting. Also, excuse me, there are rebates for rain barrel installation, as well as rain gardens that we're talking about tonight. Bosca offers, if you meet the minimum requirements for their rain garden program, a $300 rebate for installing a rain garden, as well as smart controllers, which are weather-based controllers, handy if you're on the go a lot. You can usually change programs from your phone, which people like. So one of the programs I just mentioned was removing lawn, and Bosca's offering the base rate $1 per square foot to $2 per square foot, depending on those landscapes that you're converting. If you're in the South Bay and you're going through Valley Water, their base rate is also $2 per square foot of turf to be converted. And sometimes individual cities offer an additional rebate on top of that. So do check with your city to see what your rebate may be for your specific area. And South Bay Green Gardens, if you're looking into any rebates, is a wonderful resource as far as plant knowledge. They offer landscape design templates, contractor resources, all kinds of valuable resources for you there. Thank you. And with that, we will get started our presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and mute myself.
Very good.
Thank you, Juanita.
Thank you, Victoria. All right, so let me share my screen. And we'll start from the beginning, the slideshow. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to be talking about creating rain gardens tonight. And I do a lot of native plant gardens for public spaces here in Palo Alto. And you can follow what I do on Facebook and Instagram, which are my social media, at the Primrose Way Pollinator Garden, where I post pictures of how much rain we're getting and rain gauges. what's sprouting, what insects I see, and that all those sorts of things. And I also have a YouTube channel, Primrose Way, which shows a few planting techniques, potting up seedlings, how to start seeds, just kind of some very basic things. We also have a website if you don't like social media at the primrosewaypollinatorgarden.com. As I said, I take care of 7 public gardens here in Palo Alto. And this is Embarcadero Road. And we have the Island Drive Pollinator Garden, Arcadia Place, Hopkins, Gwynda, Primrose, which was the first one, Primrose Way, and the newest one, West Greenwich Place, and the Churchill Street Pollinator Garden. And we're also trying to connect the Primrose Way Garden and the Gwynda Street Garden along Embarcadero Road via what we're calling the Embarcadero Road Pollinator Corridor. So we have lots of spaces where you can see what these plants look like in a garden situation, get a sense of what they look like throughout the year, as well as how big they get, what their shape is, different conditions that they grow in. So great way to familiarize yourself with what plants look like is just go out and look at them. Most of the plants are labeled, and we're always adding plants, so not everything might be labeled, but most of them are. And if you see something that you like, make a note of it. If you think it would work well in your own home situation, add it to your plant list. So tonight I'm going to talk in basic but really broad concepts. And I do this because I think that broad concepts are easier ways to apply what I'm telling you to your own situation. That way, if you try to do something very specific that I'm saying, it may not work for every particular garden, but an overarching concept, you can pick and choose the things that work within that concept to fit your own garden situation. So we're going to talk about definitions, so we know what we're talking about, some of the benefits of rain gardens, how you place them, what sizes and shapes should they be, what kind of depth are we talking about, of course, all important planting, and then maintenance and other considerations. I will have a caveat, and I'll head off this question at the pass right at the beginning. I always get asked this question because people feel overwhelmed by things. They don't know where to start, even though I go through things very step by step. It can seem like a lot. So people almost always ask me, where do I start? If you feel overwhelmed, hire a professional who can do this for you. There are a lot of people out there who do rain gardens and can plant those gardens up with native plants. And I can tell you where you can find some of those people and give some recommendations. But that really, if you feel overwhelmed, there's no shame in hiring a professional. You don't have to do it yourself. But if you want to jump in and try to do this yourself, you can do it. It's really not that difficult. But it's easy to get overwhelmed. All right, first of all, what is a rain garden? A rain garden is an area that receives rain from the rooftops or other surfaces, that is places where it's not going to soak in. Rain gardens are not intended to store water, but to provide an area to allow it to soak into the soil, thus recharging underground aquifers. And so here's a rain garden at the Lucy Stern Center in Palo Alto, where water runs off of the parking lot down into the center area. And you can see there's everything from grasses to a tree planted in there. And I would guess that this is not irrigated at all. So a rain garden right away is something that can water itself when it rains. So when it rains, where does water flow? And for the longest time, I didn't know the difference between these two things. We have here on the left, the sanitary sewer, okay? That's the smelly stuff. effluent from toilets, dishwashers, showers, bathtubs, sinks, washing machines, hot tub, and swimming pool water. Water that needs to be treated, okay, because it has, things, detritus from one's house, and those things need to be treated. We have water treatment plants, so that water gets treated, okay? That is separate from these storms, the storm drains. And storm drains basically take that surface water, the rainwater, and the water drains into those. That water is not treated, flows right out into our creeks, watersheds, and then down into the bay, which is why we want to keep our streets as clean as possible, because that water is not treated. Okay, and so any trash that goes into a storm drain, any kind of oil from the car, soap from people washing their cars, things like that will end up in the bay. So we really need to think about, where's the water going? And so, just to know that there are two different systems is very helpful. Okay, and some of the benefits of rain gardens. And so here on the right is a picture of a native plant rain garden done by Grassroots Ecology, which is a local nonprofit that does lots of great restoration here in the area at 1 Alma Street in Menlo Park. And you can see it, there's a slight slope going down a little bit to like the lowest point here. And all of these are native plants. You wouldn't necessarily guess it's a rain garden, but it's in an area where the land is slightly depressed down so that water can flow into the low areas because water runs downhill. And so these plants are very happy, looks very natural, it's full of life. It's just a nice example, looks very, very natural. Some of the benefits of a rain garden, you can have water soaking into the ground. And when it soaks into the ground, it gets filtered and cleaned by soil and plant roots. Okay. Water directed into a rain garden rather than a storm drain keeps pollutants on surface areas out of those storm drains. Okay. So we have nature doing the cleaning for us in a rain garden. Water soaking into the ground can help recharge the aquifers. And I think here in Palo Alto, the groundwater where I live is about 10 feet down. So it's not that deep in our area. Rain gardens, if designed and installed well, are attractive features in the residential landscape that provides unique opportunities to enhance biodiversity. If designed and installed correctly, they use less water to irrigate the landscape, and thus it saves you money that you would be spending on water. And it can be a great way to start converting your yard to native plants, but you don't know where to begin. Again, if you feel overwhelmed, go ahead and hire a professional, somebody who knows how to do a native plant rain garden. Okay, native plant rain gardens add complexity and connectivity in the environment. When we think about rainwater and rain gardens, we have to think about what are they doing functionally. Okay, and this is one of those big, broad concepts. Think of the function of water. What does water do? It keeps us alive. And so water is going to be cycling through living tissues, plants and animals, back into the atmosphere where it's going to start that hydrological cycle over and over again. So it's connected, right? Everything is connected. And when you have more connectivity and complexity, what happens is that a rain garden becomes very central to this whole cycle. And you can add more plants because everything will connect to each other. And the more that you add plants in a rain garden, the more those plants will support each other because plants form a community of organisms, especially ones that are in general the plant community that we find in our local area. So if you're adding a lot of plants, you don't have to use more water. In fact, when you're wanting to use less water, that doesn't necessarily mean less plants. And what we find is that you add more plants, you build a community of plants and other organisms that share water and help each other. They share nutrients, they share information. And then when you assemble all this stuff together with the right plants, which in turn invites in other organisms to share that water, you generate this self-assembling living system that's very easy to take care of because it takes care of itself. And a rain garden is a great way to kind of add the fuel to that system. Okay, water keeps things alive. And so I always tell people to start with a minimum of 20 different native plant species local to your area. So for a rain garden, let's talk about where you're going to put this. Okay, in your backyard, your front yard, really anywhere you have a nice kind of flat area or something that's a little bit concave, okay, something that slopes down to a shallow area. You want things to be a minimum distance of 10 feet from building foundations. You want the deepest part to be at least 5 feet away from a sidewalk, and 3 feet or from property lines and 3 feet from a public sidewalk. You want to make sure that the water doesn't flow onto a neighbor's property because that's not being a good neighbor. And it's also not a good idea for property issues. Full sun, if possible, otherwise part sun is good. You want to have the garden outside a tree canopy if possible. Otherwise, avoid large tree roots. You want to avoid underground utilities. Okay, so what's underground? Before you start digging, call 811 to mark the locations of utilities if you're not sure where they're located. Things like gas lines, things like water lines, electrical lines, anything that's an underground utility, like those things, you want to be safe. So have those things marked out for you. And that's a free service that utilities people do. You don't want to site your rain garden on top of a septic tank or a leach field or any sort of underground structures. And if you have an overflow area, you want to have like something incorporated down slope of the rain garden. And you don't want it to overflow directly into a creek or another natural waterway. Okay. As I mentioned before, relatively flat or concave sites work well. And these are sort of general checklist items. So you always want to check your local codes for other regulations. And also your designer, if you don't want to do it yourself, you can hire somebody that will check those codes and local regulations for you as part of their service. So how to make the garden. So if you're feeling like I can do this, and it's really not that hard, a rule of thumb is that the rain garden, that depressed area that you want the water to flow to, should be about 20% of the size of the area draining into it. So if you have something that's 100 square feet where water is running off, your area should be about 20 square feet, okay, which is 20% of 100. What I like to do when I'm designing, and if I don't have a survey or anything like that, or I haven't measured the site particularly, I can use an overhead satellite photo and parcel maps that show where property lines are to create a map of the house. And so what I do is I notice where the downspouts are, look at the roof line. Okay, so this is our drainage area. Here are the downspouts and going to be flowing into a rain garden. Okay, so that was pretty easy. And that's basically how I do it. So if you want to measure your site though, and you want to, make sure everything's the right size and draw to scale, you can draw a map to scale. And so to measure your site, and your designer will do this for you if you don't want to tackle it yourself. But if you do want to do it yourself, And this is an actual site measurement that I did of a client's house, is I use graph paper. You can see little squares there. And I use each square to equal 1 foot. And these squares are about 1/8 of an inch. So the scale, to draw a scale drawing, is 1/8 of an inch equals 1 foot. Now, if these squares were 1/4 inch, it would be 1/4 inch equals 1 foot. Okay, and then I lay out measuring tapes. That's what this red line is, these red lines. And then I measure along the tape. So starting from here, you can see I made a little 0 with an arrow, pulling the tape along the side of the house. 9 feet 6 inches in is the corner of the house. And then there's a downspout here at 10 feet 9 inches, the part of the window here at 11 feet 9, the end of the window at 17 feet 9 inches. See how I do the feet and inches, and then the doors here at 21 feet 3 inches, and so on and so forth. That's how I measure out in the field. If it's a small enough yard, it's easy to do. If you have a big yard or a large property, it's really worth it, if you don't have a survey, to have somebody come in and do a survey for you, where they can take elevations and see how high the ground is in different areas, and they can get things for you like the edge of your house. They can show you all this stuff. But if it's a small enough yard, and this yard was about it's 70 feet across by about 45 feet deep, so pretty small. But this is something that you can do yourself. And you want to show where everything is, make notations of like where the trees are, the edges of the lawn, the hardscape, the utilities, the fences, downspouts, existing lighting, electrical outlets, buildings, and any other notable features. And then know which way is north, so that you know where the sun's coming up and where it's going down, where the south facing walls are, where it's going to be hot and sunny, those sorts of things. So you have something to work with and to create a map. Now, you'll want to direct the water away from your building, and you can use what's called a splash block to move the water from the downspout away from the building. You don't want the water to collect here. You want everything to flow away from the house. And then it flows into a linear channel called a swale, and that will direct the water into the deepest part of the rain garden. And you put gravel in here to prevent erosion. And this is one method. This is sort of an opening here, and it's pretty easy, pretty inexpensive to do. Other people don't want there to be a splash block. Sometimes you have a connected downspout, so it's connected to a pipe that runs underground and then has an outlet within the garden itself. So you don't have to have a linear channel going to where the water is going to collect before it infiltrates. And so you can use underground pipes to direct the water into a rain garden. Again, this might be something that once your designer is done, then you can have a landscape contractor, the person who actually installs things, to do this for you. You'll place the outlet in a shallow area of the rain garden so that water can flow out of that outlet and then down into the deeper part of the rain garden. And here's one rain garden that I designed here in Palo Alto. There's lots of possibilities for the shape of these things. It could be square, it could be round, it could be oval, kidney shaped. This particular client had a planting bed that we took over, and we took out all the non-native shrubs and then created what I think is a very attractive, kind of a very shallow basin, which basically mimics the same shape of the planting bed, which kind of reinforces the form of that planting bed. So it looks very intentional. Okay, so that if you want to take out, your plants and do a native plant garden, this is a great way to get things started. So you can see that this is not connected to a downspout through a swale, but this has an emitter somewhere up here. I'm not seeing it right away, but this is the deepest part down here. But the water can then flow out of the outlet and then collect down into the shallow area. And you can line these things with large and small river rock and gravel, and that creates, year-round interest, and it helps conserve moisture because the rocks will keep moisture from evaporating out of the ground up into the atmosphere. So that's a great way to, does a lot of things. It makes it look good. It helps prevent moisture loss, provides visual interest. So that's one way to do these gardens. If you can't decide on a shape, let what's already there inspire you. You definitely want to avoid those large tree roots. This was another garden that we did underneath these redwood trees. And generally you want to avoid large tree roots and try to stay out from underneath the canopy. What happened here was that when we did the patio, we raised the grade on this side. We put the soil that we excavated from here up into this area to create an embankment. And the contractor worked with an arborist, okay, so that underneath these big redwoods, they avoided any really large roots. And the soils are really good here. It was a sandy loam, so the infiltration was really good. And you can see just how lovely and attractive this is. This is a nice dappled shade. Another view of this same swale, and this swale doesn't connect to a downspout with a splash block, but has an emitter. But we created sort of this linear channel here, and you can see how flat it is. But what happens where the emitter is up here, where the water is coming out of the downspout, down to the lowest part, the slope is about 1/4 inch drop over each foot, okay, which is a 2% slope. So it's very flat. You don't want to have a very steep swale because that'll make the water run faster. And that's when you have water moving very quickly, that's when you have erosion. So you want things to be about 2% when you're having water flow away. Again, if you feel overwhelmed to do this by yourself, have a landscape contractor who does rain gardens to help you with this, because it's really easy to make these things way too steep. Anyway, but you can see how attractive this looks and how very natural it looks. Another view of it, again, the sides of your swale, a channel like this, should be very gentle. Okay, this is not very high here. Again, you want to avoid anything that's really steep or very vertical in nature because there will be erosion. And we added decorative boulders to each side and grasses popping up and irises or native irises popping up around here, which gives the appearance of a dry creek bed. Again, super attractive looking, just, really, really pretty. So how deep do you make a rain garden? So looking it up, the Bay Area Stormwater Management Agencies Association recommends a depth of 6 inches across the bottom. So if you have a big area for water that's coming in either through a swale or through an emitter that has a pipe from a downspout connected to it or runoff or whatever, you want your big area to have a depth of about 6 inches across the bottom. And you want the rain garden to be then relatively shallow and relatively flat bottomed. And that way the water will spread out. Okay, we want to spread it out over a large area, and that helps it to soak in more quickly. If you have something that's deep with really steep sides, potentially that could retain water for a much longer time, which could invite mosquitoes in. And we want to avoid mosquitoes because the suckers bite, and they carry Zika and West Nile virus. So you want to avoid having standing water. And the way that you do that is have a big, wide, flat, shallow area, and the water's going to infiltrate more quickly with something like that. Again, you can plant in the bottom of your rain garden. It doesn't have to be big old expanse of rocks that looks like a desert. You'll find that plants will just grow in those places over a few years anyway. Things will blow in and come in, so you'll have weeds. So you want to pull those out, but you also have native plants blowing in. And you can start off with some native plants in your garden. Here we've added, in this particular garden, this was that front garden that I showed you, that planting bed that we transformed. We put in some native violets across the bottom and some native grasses and some other native shrubs around it. And these plants don't mind being underwater for a little length of time. In fact, because it's so shallow, the water is going to soak in pretty quickly. Here's another example of that where there aren't really any rocks along the bottom. There's a few, but it's, again, very subtle along the edges with some nice sedges planted along here. This one also was, I think, done by Grassroots Ecology with some nice, this looks like a carpenteria. You can tell by those white blooms there. And this looks like a nice toyon over here, some beautiful grasses. Again, looks very natural, really provides a lot of nice visual interest. Soil considerations, yet another view of that front planter here. And you can see just how shallow it is, okay? People think these things have to be big and deep, and they're actually, the opposite is true. If you have, whatever area this is draining is about 20% of that area, and it's nice and flat and shallow, that's great. But you want to test your soil first before you dig, to check out how quickly the water is flowing in. So some people have heavy clay soil, okay? So the way to see what kind of time that you're dealing with for water to soak in is to test the soil beforehand. So you'll start off by digging. So dig a hole about a foot deep and a foot wide, fill it with water, not once, not twice, but 3 times to really saturate the soil, and then fill up the hole for a 4th time, once, pretending that it's like this major rain event like we've been having, to really saturate the soil. See how long it takes then for that 4th filling to then soak into the ground. If it's taking, couple 3-4 hours, you'll probably need to amend the soil underneath in the deepest part of the rain garden to improve the water infiltration. Okay, if the water is sitting in that hole for a few hours, you know that you've got some kind of really impermeable soil, so you need to have that amended. Again, this is where a landscape contractor can really help you out with this, because that's hard work to dig up soil and to amend it so that it allows the water to soak in more quickly. So obviously, sandy soil drains faster than clay soil. So always good to know what you're dealing with before you install something. So that's a question that you can ask your contractor ahead of time. What kind of infiltration test are you doing? Can you do this? Let's test this. I want to know. Always check your soil before starting. Make sure you have that answer so that you know that your rain garden is going to work as it is intended. Because if you're going to spend the time and money to do something like this, do it correctly. And then, just sit back and relax once it's installed correctly, and then just enjoy it after that. All right, so planting. Now, I mentioned before that with water, we're considering the function of water and plants. Okay, so in a rain garden, the word garden is suggesting that you're going to have some plants. So I'm 100% California native plants. Why? California is a cornucopia of biodiversity, one of about 30 or so on the entire planet. We have almost 8,000 species of plants in California, some that are found nowhere else on the planet, more than any other state in the United States. And many of these species are drought tolerant. A lot of species in the list of plants that you can find don't mind being inundated with water and are also drought tolerant. We have a lot of bee species. Why is that important? Pollinators are important. Um, and here in California, we have almost 1,600 species of native bees, more than any other state in the United States. Across the United States, there are 4,000 species of bees. So we have almost half of the bee species here in California. Okay. And so, these gardens are going to be attractive to insects. And so you want to think, okay, these are these organisms that are going to be, using that water. And, how do you sort of make the rain garden function to its best purpose? Okay, and we have to really consider everything that's going to be using the garden, everything that's going to be using the water. So what do you plant? Again, I'm all about the California native plants, and my go-to source for information about plants, from everything from trees to bulbs, is to go to the California Native Plant Society's CalScape page, which is a super easy to use searchable database where you can find information and resources about California native plants, and then you can research the plants. And from that, you can create a plant palette of trees, shrubs, bulbs, perennials, vines, and succulents. So lots to choose from. They can tell you where to find the plants, so you can find them in nurseries, so you don't have to really search high and low. Design and inspiration. So if you need some ideas about what kinds of things will work, the design and inspiration page is great because they give you plant palettes that could get you started. Okay. And then butterflies. What's that? Why is that there? This is actually one of the reasons why I go to this page, because again, we're going to have organisms that are using the plants. And so what do I mean by that? Well, instead of thinking about what to plant, I always think about who to feed. And so we know that the invertebrate animals out there, the insects, are super important to plants, super important to the life cycle of, just keeping water flowing through the environment. All these organisms are going to be part of this hydrological cycle that will be started with your rain garden. So biology is really important. And we know that because plants need insects, pollinators, to survive. Okay, so when bees go to flowers and collect nectar and pollen, and they put those pollen and nectar resources together to make a little loaf to feed their larvae so that we can get more baby bees and more bees for the future. They are vegetarians like that. What happens is that they fertilize plants, and then the plants make seeds. Okay, so plants need insects to survive. And we know that when you have pollinators moving the pollen around, you get more variability in plants. You get speciation, you get variations in color and form that you wouldn't necessarily get with something that was wind pollinated. Some plants spew forth lots and lots of pollen into the wind, and by chance, other things get pollinated. So with a pollinator, the speciation, those variations in form and color, any sort of mutations, all that happens more quickly. So one of those powerful biological tools in our toolbox. Okay, so we know that that's super important. And pollinators then, because they're helping plants make more plants by making seeds, what pollinators are doing is they are providing those plants then for butterfly and moth larvae, the caterpillars, to feed on. So like the monarch butterfly that only feeds on milkweed, you know, we know that a lot of these insects are super specific about what they eat. And so pollinators provide the support for all those other organisms, okay? Caterpillars are juicy. That's where the water is going, into organisms' tissues. So you get this biological cycling of that water, you know? So it's not just enough to think about the water going into the ground and soaking into the roots and everything like that. The water goes into the roots, but then it goes up into the plant, which is eaten by the insect. And that's, you know, some insects do drink water, but a lot of them get it from the plant tissues that they eat. So biological factors, the point here, broad concept, is those are maybe more important considerations than abiotic or non-biological factors like climate, geology, and water for determining what to plant. So consider the function of the various plants as you're putting them in. And so I always try to choose a plant based on the number of caterpillars it feeds. Some plants feed more than a single species. Some plants feed hundreds or thousands of other things. Super important to have those species. If you want to stay with drought tolerant plants and figure, okay, so we're thinking about every single drop of water, where it's going, into the ground, into plant tissues, into insects. So how much is each plant actually using? And so this is a great resource to find out how much water a plant uses. And the WUCLS, the Water Use Classification of Landscape Species, is an online searchable database for plant factors of individual plant species. It's published by the University of California, Cooperative Extension, and the California Department of Water Resources. And so plants are ranked based on the percent of water of turf grass, of lawn, okay, which they consider turf grass at 100%. And so that's the reference against which all other plants are measured. So that percentage of how much turf grass is using is called the plant factor. So very low might use between 0 and 10% of what a lawn would use, low 20 to 30%, and so forth. So super useful to check out, you know, high water use plants, medium use water use plants, super low, and then very low. So really handy. When you're laying out plants, again, and you know, if you feel like you're overwhelmed, hire a professional. And so how do you, if you want to do it yourself though, okay, you got your grid, right? And your plan that you made on the graph paper. How do you know how many plants and what to plant and where to put them and everything? So basically, when you're planting in an area, the way that you space things out is you add plants, you show them on your plan as a circle. And that circle, the diameter of that, how far across that is, this is why it's so important to do a scale drawing, is the mature diameter of that plant. So if you have something that's 12 feet by 12 feet here, you know, you have a plant that's maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 feet in diameter. And the way that you space things out is that you have these circles of various species just touching or barely overlapping. And that's a great way to start figuring out how many plants, because then you don't have to guess about spacing. You know, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 of the yellows, 3 of the greens, and so on. So that's just how you know how many to get of a particular species, is go by the mature diameter. They might be small when you first put them in, but they will grow very quickly for the most part and get bigger than you could have possibly imagined in a very short period of time. I found in the 7 gardens that we've planted, that plants seem to just, especially the ones that are local to this area, just grow like so quickly. They grow, I don't want to say grow like weeds, but they do grow quickly. So plants, the beginning of everything. And I call this my my photons to protein slide, just to give you the sense of, what's happening. So energy from the sun then gets incorporated into plants, things like caterpillars. Okay, this is a nice juicy protein milkshake for baby birds. And a native plant garden becomes a bird feeder. Most baby birds are fed on caterpillars. If you've ever seen a mother bird take a caterpillar or father bird, shove it down baby bird's throat, it's not a gentle process. And so a nice, juicy, soft caterpillar is going to make a lot of baby birds. And what we've discovered is that, as a rule, native insects only eat the native plants they evolved with. And this is one of the reasons why I literally never plant something that is not native, unless it's like food for humans, like, an orange tree or an apple tree or something like that, is because those non-native plants, they might be decorative, but they're not suiting the function in the environment to which plants are made. And plants are made to feed different food webs. That is the actual function of plants. Plants can be pretty and smell nice and have pretty blossoms, but really the purpose of plants is to make it so that the rest of the food webs can access the sun's energy. And so in terms of being a good designer, I always want to think about, what is the most optimum use of the space by what's going to be optimally keeping things alive and keeping that hydrologic cycle going, and just get that self-assembling living system moving so that I don't have to take care of it as much. If you do it right, these things basically take care of themselves. So as such, plants are not decorations. Okay, so when we're planting these rain gardens, remember, plants are food. And that means when you're planting food, just like when you're setting the buffet up for the big event, that your native plants will attract many native pollinators and other insects, and in turn birds. Guaranteed 100% this happens. And so just remember, plants aren't decoration. Plants are food. Plants are full of water. And that water then becomes accessible to those things that eat those plants. So why is it so important to see native plants as food? Because these native plants will attract a variety of native pollinators and other insects. It's best to avoid making your garden an ecological trap. So this is part of those other considerations. An ecological trap is something in the environment that makes it easy for organisms to be killed. So if you have this big buffet of native plants, you have all these insects coming in, but you're using things like leaf blowers and pesticides and lights that stay on all night outside, that's going to make it easier to not allow them to complete their life cycles. Okay, and that basically stops that biological hydrocycle that we're taking part in by doing a rain garden. And so, just all these broad concepts, but really important to consider in the whole scheme of things. So, when you're talking to your designer or designing it yourself, think about the kinds of experiences that you'll want. Do you want to have a cool shade, a warm sunny spot? Think about those aspects that you want to have in your garden. And this is that remember that animation I showed you with the overhead, with the downspouts and the roof and the arrows? This is a last year in that garden. All of these flowers have reseeded themselves. I didn't do anything. This is what happens when you get that hydrological cycle going and plant things that are happy growing here. The things that have grown here for thousands of years is that you start storing water in living tissue. This is what that garden looked like the year before, where we just had a small grouping of these tidy tips here, and a small clump of poppies. The year before, the year after, we saw all those other beautiful plants. They just took over and became a beautiful meadow. And this year it's looking even better. It's the third year for that garden, and it's going to be spectacular. But the sequence of how you plant, where do you start? So I always tell people, start large and then work small. So start with selecting your large plants first, then your shrubs, then your perennials. You want to try to fit in as many trees as possible. Trees are good. Trees do a lot of things. Trees really are some of the basic parts in that living system that really help other things move and do their thing and connect with other things. Then you want to come in with your shrub layer, and your shrub layer should compose over 60% of all of your plants. I tell people to focus on those evergreen shrubs, okay, the ones that don't lose their leaves all at once. Those evergreen shrubs are going to look green and moist all year long and store that water in their tissues. And then in the remaining spaces, fit in as many grasses, perennials, bulbs, succulents, and ground covers and vines as possible. And then I shoot for a mix of herbaceous plants that die completely back, and woody perennials that have stems and trunks that maintain their shape and form over the whole year. And then I throw in some annuals for color, like these tidy tips. And the patterns that they do every year is different in terms of reseeding themselves. So it's like something that's very dynamic and changing. But as you can see, this is our rain garden here. Basically, it's a couple of swales coming down to a largish flat area in here. And this particular yard this year is completely covered in wildflowers. It's pretty amazing. And again, you can plant at the bottom of your rain garden things that don't mind being in water for short periods of time. One great plant, look how pretty this is, Limus condensatus. This is a big, chunky grass that has these bluish green leaves coming out. Just a beautiful plant, can get very large. And, once things dry out, you can actually have like bumblebees nesting underneath. You can have birds nesting in these. When you start manipulating the hydrological cycle in your yard, this is what happens. You get all of the life that water attracts coming to your yard. So you end up with like this habitat, like a park almost, in your yard. On the slopes of your rain garden, you can have species that are lower water use, and then on the outside, go for a mix of those trees and shrubs, okay? Because those roots are going to go in and they're going to go towards that water source that is your rain garden. All those roots are going to look for that water there. And it's just, it just gets everything started so nicely. Once you have a rain garden, you'll wonder, why did I ever have a lawn? When we know that outdoor irrigation accounts for most of a home's water use. Lawns can use up to 50% of outdoor water use. I've run the numbers because I do design irrigation systems. I run the numbers on what every plant uses, what lawns use, and the math works out. Hands down, lawns use the most water of any plant that you put in a garden. So really, get rid of your lawn. It's, ask yourself, what am I really using it for? You know, most people walk on them to get to one place to another. Maybe stepping stones would work just as well. So again, think in terms of function. Think in terms of like, what is the most optimal use of that piece of grass, or that piece of ground rather. So these broad concepts, you guys are going, oh, we're just going to learn about rain gardens. Rain gardens are part of a bigger system. So we're talking about the biological hydrocycle of both plants and animals that store water in their living tissues and then move it through the environment using various processes. Okay, so water's never static. It's being used by living things. All right, an example of this, and I like to talk about, just how things store water in their living tissues. Again, a broad concept. We're using that immense power of biology to bring in and keep moisture in the garden. We're using good design, allowing the water to get into the ground so that roots can send it into plants like dahlias here, one of my favorite succulents, to really store water in living tissues. Little lizards are eating those insects that are eating the plants. This lizard might be, and this is just a regular old fence lizard, he's probably going to become food for something else. Things like bulbs store water in their bulby tissues that are underground. Okay, so water doesn't just go into the ground. Water is used by things. So use those tap-rooted plants to draw on the water table and deep soil moisture. Use native succulents. Okay, succulent means like juicy. Bulbs, fleshy crowned plants, and encourage animals to keep the moisture in your garden. And paired with those non-biological ways to reduce water loss like mulch, shade, rocks, and etc., more moisture will be in the garden. Okay, so you won't have to irrigate it. To get the plants started, you might have to water things for the first year or two, maybe. But once plants are established, if you use the correct native plants, a lot of them don't have to be watered at all. They can survive on rain just fine. And you can see how things react to water. Okay, so native plants, again, they have active and dormant seasons depending on temperature and moisture. So again, dahlias, favorite succulent. Here we have Dudleya virens. This is in March versus September. Okay, so they're responding to water in the environment. Still juicy in September, maybe not as juicy as in March. Another kind of Dudleya, the Bretonii, unfurls with the moisture and then kind of crumples up during the dry season. Plants, these California native plants are really adapted to these various moisture cycles. And you can see it so clearly in these plants. They don't look the same all year long. Okay, a lot of plants have various seasons where they look super green, super lush. And then during the drier season, which is, 3 months or so, they look a little dry. That's fine. That's how they're supposed to look. I mean, if you were to try to water this plant in September, it will never look like this, the March version, because it's too warm and they would probably rot. So, I do not water these plants at all. I just, if they're not going to live, that's fine. My plants live because they know how to handle the moisture situation. Okay, so in other considerations here, these native gardens, these native rain gardens, they're just less maintenance than a non-native garden with a lawn. Okay, so you're probably thinking, oh, why do I need to take out my lawn and replace it. It's just better. It's just better for the environment. It costs less money because you're not paying for somebody to come out and mow the lawn each week. You're not paying for somebody to like blow out the planting beds where all the larvae of the butterflies are. All that goes away. Basically, all you're really doing is keeping the weeds at bay, irrigating plants to establish them like once a week, for about a year. And when you're irrigating plants, watering them, you should encourage the roots to search for water. So water deeply just outside of the root ball, prune very sparingly or not at all even, unless you need to clean up for fire safety. So it's like less maintenance. You don't actually have to do anything. You don't have to fertilize. You don't really have to amend. You can put some mulch down, but later just let leaves fall in the garden and leave them in place. Okay, you can leave areas of bare dirt for bee nests, and about 70% of those native bees nest underground. Don't use leaf blowers in planted areas. If you're using a leaf blower, you can use that to clean up the hardscape like driveways and sidewalks and patios. And again, use things that are electrically powered so that you're not generating fumes in the environment. Okay, so it's just better to have a nice, clean, low emission kind of device if you're doing that. And then don't use pesticides, herbicides, or fungicides. I have 7 gardens and I try to do as little work as possible, which has actually worked out really well because these gardens do not really want to be fussed with. The animals that come in to nest there don't want me interfering a lot. So I tend to let things look a little bit wild, but we have different gardens with sort of different aesthetics. So you can go out and check them out, see how these plants might look in your own garden with your own aesthetic. I'm not going to go through this too much, but again, avoid creating an ecological trap. Remember that once you start generating the system, the self-assembling living system, you want to help that, that cycle, these things to keep the water flowing through the tissues into the atmosphere and back again, because that's what water does, right? It goes through living tissues. And your native plant garden, your native rain garden, with its abundant blooms and nectar and pollen for bees and host plants for butterfly and moth larvae, will be very attractive to these insects. Okay, because you look around, most gardens around are filled with non-native plants. There's nothing to eat for many species of birds and insects. You plant up a native plant garden, all those creatures will come to your garden and it'll be like, it's like a mini Eden or a mini habitat. It's wonderful. And so you don't want that to be the lure that allows them to come in and then they're killed through, light pollution at night. So this is actually a moth outside my bathroom window. We added blackout curtains so that this guy could then go on and complete his life cycle, go and mate, and eggs are laid, and more moths are generated, etc. So lights outside, you can put things on timers, you can use yellow lights that are not as attractive, blackout curtains, motion sensors, lots of different things that you can do. I've already covered the rest of these things mostly. Just try to help things complete their life cycles. And some final thoughts here on rain gardens and what does it really mean when you're installing a rain garden. It starts you on a journey. And among the other ecosystem services that a rain garden provides, you'll start to see more of these relationships sort of revealing themselves to you, and you start to learn how to optimize how that works and how productive things become. You'll end up with lots more seeds, plants, butterflies, birds coming to your garden. And that abundance of life that you see as well as your understanding of how it all works, then leads to an enhancement of how you appreciate it and how touched by the beauty of it. This is what happens. The more that you know about how it works will enhance your appreciation and your role in caring for nature's complex beauties. So I know it seems like a lot. And if you're overwhelmed, I mean, you're giving you all these broad concepts, you know, there's no shame in hiring a professional to do this, but you can do it yourself. Just start small, plan it out, do the research, see what's appropriate for your area, have people, have a couple of consultations if you need to. And it's still planting season. I like to plant during the rainy season because that's the easiest time to establish plants. But once you get started on this and you see what happens and how the garden literally takes care of itself, the money and the time it saves and all the other benefits, plus the rebates that you get for doing it. I hope everybody gets a start on their gardens and gets them in this season so that you can enjoy it then during the summer. And with that, I'm happy to take any sort of questions that people might have.
I haven't seen any questions come in through the chat, but I just wanted to reinforce, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. What you were talking about, the native plants, especially, I'm a horticulturalist and my front yard is it's very small, but it's entirely California natives. And, friends, neighbors, family have sat and just watched things from my front porch. It's like a little party. It's like watching a documentary, just sitting in your garden to see all the life that comes in and out. So it was wonderful to hear you talking about that, because it really is a free show in your garden.
Yes, I'm always amazed. And I do what I call weekly rounds. I go out to each of our pollinator gardens every Friday or so to document the species that I see there. And it's just like it's like a party every time.
It's exciting.
Very
You
exciting.
watch for the newcomers and you watch for the regulars, and it's enjoyable.
With every new species of plant that we add, that just adds just that extra bit of complexity and something really tasty in the buffet for everything else to come in. And I tell you, it's just once you get started and it's like how many more plants can I cram into a space? And there's always room for something else, whether it's if you think everything is planted densely, you can probably still fit in some bulbs or vines or small succulents. There's always a spare inch somewhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But a rain garden is literally like free irrigation. I mean, the way that the plant roots work, growing towards those water sources. I mean, to me, with that and the rebates that people can get to do this, it's like, why wouldn't you do it? And
absolutely.
It's just so much better, and it's so much less work than a
It is.
Just, because these gardens don't want to be coddled,
Right.
They're like, no, we got it, fine.
Thank you for birthing us. Now set us free.
Exactly. Just sit back and enjoy the show. And, it's like one of the plants that I have in my home garden is Encelia californica, which looks like it's a shrub that has yellow daisy-like flowers on it for literally 9 months of the year. I mean, this thing blooms its head off. And, different bee species will come out during the year. Some come out early, some come out summertime, some come out late. That plant is covered with these insects all year long. And it's also a larval food source for skipper butterflies, which I did not know.
Oh.
It's not listed as a larval food source, but I see their larvae on it all the time. And I have so many skippers. I know. It's just, it's crazy. And so if you go to my Instagram, you'll see I've got a lot of videos of these creatures. And then I like put in some music to like,
Awesome.
just because it's so entertaining. It's like there's really no downside to it.
Well, with those inspirational words, we're hoping that our participants become equally enthusiastic to install their own rain gardens. How are people able to get a hold of you if they have questions after the presentation, Juanita?
So, they can go to the primrosewaypollinatorgarden.com and you can message me through that. You can message me through my Instagram or Facebook feed, or you could even try me at my Juanita Salisbury Landscape Architecture .com. So it's not that hard to find me.
Cool.
And I'm happy to answer questions for people, although I'm not currently doing any sort of design work myself because I'm working on a few other things at the moment. And so my time is a little bit limited. But there are, as I mentioned before, you can go to the California Native Plant Society, the Santa Clara Valley chapter, and they have a list of resources. And that resource, one of the most important ones, is garden professionals. And there are people who design, there are people who design and install, and there are people who just install. So, and that do California native plant gardens specifically. And so that's a great resource if people are overwhelmed. And this comes up with every talk that I give. People are like, oh, I don't know where to start. If you're overwhelmed and it seems like too much, just hire somebody who knows what they're doing to get it started, to get the bones in. And then over time you can, the site preparation, things like that, that's the hardest part always,
Right.
getting things going. Planting itself is
The
actually,
icing.
planting is kind of like putting the frosting on the cupcake. So,
Yes.
and when I do these gardens like our Embarcadero Road project, most of the money that we use for that goes to ivy removal and
Oh,
preparation
for
because
sure.
plants are super cheap.
Yeah.
But it's like site prep, right?
And ivy especially is so pernicious.
The bane of my existence, but we're slowly winning that war.
Good. Well, it's been a wonderful evening and thank you for such an informative and valuable presentation. And the recording will be available through Bosca and its affiliate members. So that's always available to rewatch at any time. But again, thank you. And with that, I guess we'll say good night.
Thank you, Victoria. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Juanita. Take care. Good night, everyone.